I must say there are times when you do feel like almost holding your head in despair when you look at the sheer foolishness and the sheer stupidity of the actions taken by the leadership of the European Union. There are some people, when you see them, when you have experience of them, um, you describe them as people who, if there's any chance of getting things wrong, will always do so. And I'm beginning to think it's a bit like that with the European Union policy, particularly in regard to the Ukrainian war. It is difficult to see that from the beginning of this process that the European Union has done anything right. In fact, I would say practically every action they have taken has been guaranteed to make things worse. At the very beginning of this process, very beginning of the conflict, 3 days into the conflict, Ukraine seemed willing to engage in negotiations and had entered what appeared to be very meaningful peace talks in Istanbul. And two things happened. The first of all was that the European Union voted a massive arms package, 550 million euros, for exporting weapons. And secondly, Boris Johnson, not a member of the European Union, of course, but a significant European leader, persuaded them that if they did make any territorial concessions to Russia, that Europe would cease to back them. And I think he was speaking for more than just Britain when he said that. He was speaking for the West in general. So if anything, that particular process added fuel to the fire and ensured that an unnecessary conflict has continued, where it could possibly have reached a negotiated conclusion very early on in the conflict. Practically everything that Europe has done in terms of sanctions since then has also not only had no effect on Russia, it's probably strengthened Russia's position. The European Union seems to have come to a very peculiar conclusion in regard to oil, that if you make it more difficult to get oil, the price of oil will come down. Of course, that's the direct opposite of what happens. The price of oil has gone up. Russia is continuing to export oil. The fact that the European Union is now making it impossible for its own industrialists to get a cheap supply of fossil fuels, either oil or gas, is not affecting Russia. Russia will find markets for its products. But the European Union is going to be in very, very serious trouble, particularly come this winter. There is significant alarm in the German business community about the continuation of German industry and about the continuation of German business if the rigid policy of sanctions is continued. Remember that Europe, for the past 20 years or so, has made itself completely dependent on Russian oil and gas products for the continuation of its industry. And you simply can't choke off that supply of industry and assume that nothing will happen. Michael Martin came back from Brussels recently, wagging his finger as he does and warning us all of the terrible rocky roads that are ahead, the difficult times that are ahead in regard to the price of oil. And he was speaking to us, as he tends to do, as if all of this was our fault in some way, and that what else did we expect? He seems to have had no regard whatsoever for the fact that he is one of the decision makers in Europe. He went along with an absolutely crazy sanctions policy. The upshot of this will be that come next September, October, European and Irish consumers are going to find it very, very difficult indeed to heat their homes, and they're going to find it very difficult to put fuel in their cars and to travel to work. The idea that you can, like that, you can cut off the supply of oil and not have significant economic downturn effects is absolutely ludicrous. I think it shows the extent to which the European Union is engaged primarily in an exercise in virtue signaling. They seem to be disconnected from reality. They only seem to want to be able to say, look, we are standing by Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine has been the victim of an unnecessary, terrible and brutal war. but it is necessary to have a sense of realpolitik. Are the actions that we're taking actually having any good, any beneficial effect? Are they damaging Russia, or are they just damaging Europe? And it seems to me that the latter is primarily the case. One of the aspects of the sanctions is that it will be possible for Russia to export its oil to third countries, who will then be able to export that oil to Europe. So Russia can export oil to Turkey, who can then export it to a South American country, and European purchasers can then purchase it and bring it into Europe. So the net impact of that, of course, would be only that the European taxpayer will be paying a much, much higher price for oil, because every broker who buys and resells the oil will take a cut. And of course, there are massive additional transport costs being introduced into the exportation of oil than if it came directly from Russia. In any normal political system, it is the people who show ability and who have a track record who tend to rise to the top. But somehow or other in the European Union system, that seems to be the direct opposite of what happens. The people who have least ability tend to get promoted to the European Commission and to, in particular, the office of the presidency of the European Commission. Our last European Commission president was an amiable drunk who was not that amiable when he was fully drunk, and who made an absolute hash of the Brexit negotiations, certainly as far as trade with Britain is concerned, and as far as Ireland is concerned, as Jean-Claude Juncker. The present president of the European Commission was widely regarded as probably the most incompetent foreign minister that Germany ever had, allowing her military budget to run way over, and failing to introduce the necessary reforms that are required of the German military. She was effectively gotten rid of by Angela Merkel, her chancellor, who kicked her upstairs to the European Commission, where it was felt she could do less damage. She has been the principal architect of the sanctions policy, and in fact she's doing even more damage now than she did when she was a government minister. A lot of this stems from the peculiar political construction of the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen will never have to answer for her actions. She'll never have to face an electorate. You can't fire her. There's no individual chancellor or prime minister or president who's capable of saying, look, we've had enough of this. This is insane. We have to get rid of this lady. That can't happen. So when you have a political culture like that, where major decisions are made by people who will never face an electorate, then it's not a very healthy form of politics. It tends to be a very introspective form of politics, a very elitist form of politics, and one which is increasingly removed from the needs of ordinary people. However, the level of incompetence seems to be such that you begin to wonder, is it actually incompetence, or is there perhaps some malevolent influence on the whole thing? I mean, could anybody really engage in a policy that is calculated to destroy European industry, is calculated to impoverish the European taxpayer, and is calculated to immiserate so many of its more vulnerable citizens? Could anybody carry out policy like that without having a deliberate intent behind it? And perhaps in this case, the deliberate intent is that of promoting the ideology of global warming, which is, as we know, promoted by our own Green Party and by Green parties in many of the more powerful countries such as Germany. That may well be the case, and if it is the case, it is indeed a very worrying thing, because the so-called transition that we all hear about cannot be carried out rapidly. If you think that the way of effecting the transition is to simply cut off oil supplies or make them impossibly expensive, and that there are not going to be negative impacts to that, then you do not understand the energy market. It may well be that in 10 or 20 years that the renewables will be more effective, and they will be able to form a substantial component of our energy needs, but that is simply not the case at the moment, and the policy now being pursued within the European Union is turning out to be disastrous. In regard to the sanctions, the West and Europe in general are treating Russia the same way as they would treat a small or a third world country. Europe and America succeeded in killing 500,000 Iraqi children by sanctions, both food sanctions and by withholding medical supplies from those children. But Russia isn't like that. It is largely self-sufficient in most of what it needs. Similarly, Europe bombed Libya back into the Stone Age to an extent that slave markets made their reappearance on the streets of Libya shortly thereafter. This is thanks to the British and French governments and thanks to Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State at the time. But you can't do that to Russia because they actually have weapons that are just as powerful as we are. So the sanctions policy, which is designed to intimidate small countries, is not going to work against Russia. It's also very obvious that many other large blocs of countries are beginning to get rather fed up with the attitude, Eurocentric attitude of Europeans in regard to world sanctions. The Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, put it very well recently when he said that Europe always seems to think that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but it doesn't have the slightest interest in the world's problems generally. It certainly doesn't think that they're Europe's problems. I think that many large emerging economies are getting fed up with this notion that the United States and Europe controls the world and can order the destruction of other countries as it has done in the past. The West may well be approaching its Suez moment. In the Suez Crisis in 1956, Britain and France were very quickly confronted with reality and forced to realize that they had a much diminished role in the world and that they were not able to direct the affairs of other countries in the way that they had before. That may be about to happen to Europe, and it may be long overdue. An example of this is again Michael Martin coming back and wagging his finger at the Prime Minister of India and saying that his policy in regard to Russia was, quote, not acceptable, unquote. This is a statement being made to a Prime Minister of a country which has 1/5 of the world's population. It's perfectly capable of determining its own policies. I think that shows a certain folly de grandeur on the part of Mr. Martin. That is quite regrettable, but it's somewhat typical of a political system that is divorced from reality. And that's what happens when you have a European Union political system where there is no electorate, where there's no demos, where there's no democracy. Europe has consistently turned its back on democracy within its own institutions, and of course it is trying to corrupt or undermine the democracies of its own member states, as it has done in Ireland through the referendums, debacles, as it is doing now against Poland and Hungary. Do we really think that Poland, a country of almost 40 million people, with a history of standing up to repression, do we really think that they're not capable of appointing their own judiciary, of making provision for the appointment of their own judiciary, without interference from the Brussels Commission? The only thing the Brussels Commission wants in regard to the Polish judiciary is to ensure that they will go along with the absurd, destructive, anti-family and gender ideology, which is the stock and trade of the European Union. We already do that. We already promote these vile ideologies without being forced to do so. It is typical of a captive state that they will engage in their own destruction rather than being told to do so by their oppressor. And I'm afraid that's the nature of the relationship we have fallen into with Europe. It is now an abusive relationship, and unfortunately we need to get out of it. Europe has been blaming the so-called COVID crisis for its ineptitude and for its harsh policies over the last 2 years, and is now moving into a situation where it has got a new scapegoat, namely Vladimir Putin. And he can be blamed for all the ills of the world. He's being blamed for the energy crisis, despite the fact that, of course, the energy crisis is entirely the construct of the United States and the European sanctions. He's being blamed for food shortages worldwide, despite the fact that he's made it very clear that Russia will not, under any circumstances, impede the exportation of grain from the Ukraine. They can use either Russian ports, or they will agree, if the Ukrainians remove their mines from the port of Odessa, that they will not use that as an opportunity to launch a seaborne attack. He's already stated this. Putin's also being blamed for inflation, but of course inflation goes back to the reckless policies pursued in the wake of the financial crash going back 12 years, and also of course to the massive printing of money that took place during the absurd response to the COVID crisis. So I'm afraid you have to look elsewhere for your blame, and maybe we should start looking at the political system of Europe and what's gone wrong with it. It is beginning to show all the hallmarks of a backward-looking, totalitarian socialist system. That's what happens when you refuse to enter into debate. That's what happens when you don't have democracy. That's what happens when you try to shut down democracy within your member states. That's what happens when you close down free speech and all of the hate speech legislation, the dreadful, dreadful legislation that we see coming into our Dáil is at the behest of the European Union and their dreadful directives. We see the same absurdist policies in regard to environmental law, in regard to EPA law, in regard to especially areas of conservation and so on and so forth, which are tying up our planning system in a network of regulations from which it is impossible to escape. The European Union system is increasingly looking like the old Soviet system in the last days of its collapse. It's very difficult for a country like Ireland to know how to react to this. We're a small country, we'll be buffeted by the winds that blow. But we can at least stand up and point out the damage that is being done by European Union policy. We do not have to be slavish in our acquiescence to these policies. We can at least indicate the harm that they can do, and where possible, try not to comply with them. Europe has done wonderful things in the past. The whole free trading arrangement has led to prosperity within Europe, even though I think that may be about to come to an end, and I think a large part of that prosperity has been artificial. But it has now gone into a system of effective political despotism, which will always be destructive both economically, socially and culturally. We need to start planning for the days when that system will come to an inevitable collapse. And I think that there are already rumblings in some of the larger countries in Europe, particularly in the business community, that this is not working. And a lot of things may be brought to the fore by the effects of this war and the effects of Europe's policies in regard to the war. I think that may all happen come next September and October when, I'm not going to use a vulgar expression, but when things get rather difficult for the European consumer. So this has been Michael Leahy of the Irish Freedom Party, outlining many of the difficulties with the European political system and outlining what happens when you ignore democracy and you creep into totalitarianism. We will stand up to Europe and we will try to propose a meaningful means of exit for Ireland from the European Union. Thank you for listening.